um, which will be recorded. Our first Zoom, though if you've seen our brochures, there's a lot of events going on around our community read, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I'm really excited tonight to have with us Heather Bruegl, who is going to share some of her thoughts on the book, and then we'll open up for some discussion. So I'm going to turn things over to Heather. Welcome.
Hi, Thea, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting me. I am so excited. When I was reached out about this request, I was like, Braiding Sweetgrass is one of my favorite books. So I'm very excited to be able to share with you a little bit about my thoughts on the book, pull out my favorite part of the book and talk to you about it. I'm actually also going to compare it to another book that I read that I will give you the information on, and maybe you can read it too, should you want to. And then, like Thea said, go into a little bit of conversation and discussion, because also your thoughts on this are really important as well. And so I think that is how we're going to spend this time together. So thank you so much for coming together and wanting to hear maybe what I have to say. And so I'm looking forward to chatting with you all a little bit more. Um, Okay, so just a little bit about myself. My name is Heather Bruegl. I'm a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, and I'm a first-line descendant of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican people. Both tribal nations made their home in what is now New York State. The Stockbridge Munsee Mohican people on the eastern side of the Hudson River, and the Oneida people, which are part of the Haudenosaunee people, on the western side of the Hudson River. So those are the people that I hail from. I did happen to live in New York for about a year and a half and thoroughly enjoyed living in the homelands and being on the land. And I think we're going to see that land is a major theme throughout tonight's discussion. And so I just want people to understand the importance of land. And so for me, the first time being able to see the Hudson River, or what my ancestors called it, the Mahicanatuck, which is the river that flows both ways, it didn't feel strange. It didn't feel unfamiliar in a very weird way. It felt super familiar. It felt as though the land knew who I was, that the river knew who I was, and that I didn't feel out of place. I felt this sense of belonging and this rematriation of myself to the land and understanding my place in it and walking where my ancestors walked and living where my ancestors lived. It was a very powerful experience. And so whenever I'm able to get back to New York to visit, I thoroughly love it. I thought it would feel strange, right? You know, you're going, the first time I went there, I was going on vacation. So I was going to a new place, but it wasn't actually a new place. The land knew who I was, and I knew who the land was. And so there was this very big connection there. And that's something that Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And so there's that land connection. And so I just wanted to bring my personal connection to the land in the state of New York and where I fit in with that. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work as a historian and an Indigenous consultant. I also work as a curator. I work as a researcher. I wear many, many hats and do a lot of different things. And I love the work that I do. My contact information is on the screen here. Please feel free to take it down. You can contact me at my Gmail. I do have a Twitter. I'm not super active on that Twitter right now anymore, but I am very active on Instagram. So you can send me a DM through Instagram as well. And then you can also reach me at my website, which is strictly just my name, heatherbriegel.com. You can contact me on that website as well. But you can also see a list of talks that I have. I do share a few selected videos up there that are about different talks I have done in the past. And you can also see what events are coming up. And I do make it very distinguishable whether an event is in person or if it is online or if it's hybrid. I guess one of the great things that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic is a lot of things were moved to hybrid or online. I like that. It's more accessible. More people can join. So I do make sure that on my website, I let people know whether or not an event is in person or online. So that's just a little bit about myself. Again, the contact information is here. Screenshot it, take a picture, write it down. feel free to contact me for anything, even if it's just a simple question or book recommendations or podcast recommendations. I'm happy to give those out. I do want to give a land acknowledgement for the land that the state of New York sits on. We acknowledge that we're all coming from different locations that were the ancestral homes of Indigenous nations. For example, today I'm actually not in my home state of Michigan. I am in the next state over in Wisconsin. And so I'm coming to you from the land of the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk people. But in New York, we acknowledge the Mahikaniak, which are the people of the waters that are never still. We acknowledge the Lenape, who are the original people. We honor the Haudenosaunee, who are the people of the Longhouse, and the Shinnecock people of Long Island. We acknowledge that through forced land cessions and removal, these nations were removed from the land that they called home, and their seats of government are now located in Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Canada, and other parts of New York. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present. We understand that this acknowledgement is just the first step in building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Land acknowledgements to me are super important. I know everybody has their own take on it, and that's totally fine. There is no wrong or right way to feel about land acknowledgements. For me, they're important. For me, when I say a land acknowledgement, it feels like I'm entering into a ceremony, maybe giving a prayer to the ancestors, letting them know, hey, we're going to be talking about some Indigenous history or Indigenous topics. And I encourage people to think about whose land that you might be on. There's a great website, nativeland.ca. You can go to it. You can literally type in your address and it'll tell you whose land that you're on. Gives you about approximate idea of whose land that you're on. And it is a really amazing resource and it can get you started in figuring out who you are honoring on your own land that you are stewarding right now. So I just wanted to give that acknowledgement. And again, I'm currently in Wisconsin, so I'm Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. So the Oneida that left New York came to Wisconsin, and I am currently on the land of the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk people, right near Lake Winnebago, which used to be a very big ricing lake. People would go to gather, the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee would gather rice in that lake. As progress grew, the area became very industrialized, and a lot of lumber barons or other people would come in, and eventually the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk no longer have this land in their possession, though it is their ancestral home, and I want to make sure that I am honoring that. So tonight we are going to talk about braiding sweetgrass. I'm going to give just a few thoughts of my own about braiding sweetgrass, and we can go from there to conversation. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about who the author is of Braiding Sweetgrass. It's Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a citizen, an enrolled citizen of Potawatomi Nation out of Oklahoma. She was born in upstate New York, though, and she actually still currently lives in upstate New York in an old farmhouse. She holds a degree in botany from SUNY ESF and a PhD in botany from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So there is a Wisconsin connection there as well. The Potawatomi lived in Midwest region, so there were some Potawatomi who were in Michigan. There were also Potawatomi here in Wisconsin. And Potawatomi Nation was removed, and they now call parts of Oklahoma their home. In 2022, she was named a MacArthur Fellow, which was huge. Not a lot of Indigenous people have been named MacArthur Fellows, and so for her to be able to be named one was huge. It also is about the inclusivity of who becomes a MacArthur Fellow. And so the work that she has done in land rematriation, but also in connection of plants and healing and botany and all of that, but with Indigenous science behind it, is very groundbreaking work that's not done anymore. I think sometimes when we think about science, and we'll talk more about this as we get into it, there is a very Western way of thinking about science. But when you read Braiding Sweetgrass, you understand that there is Indigenous methodologies behind that. There's Indigenous thought process behind that. And so she gets into some of that. And I'm going to discuss some of that tonight with you when we talk about one of my favorite parts of the book. And then when we talk about another book that I want to talk to you about as well. Her interests include the restoration of ecological communities, and restoration to land. Again, land plays a very important role in braiding sweetgrass, but also in who we are as Indigenous people. When we think about land, um, it's the land to us is a living and breathing entity. There is life within the land. A very good friend of mine, her name is Jasmine Niosh, and she is Menominee. I like to quote her when she said this about land, that we are land in the temporary form of a human. So when we are no longer of this earth in our human physical form, we go back to the land. Before we are born, we are part of the land. And so when she said that we are land in the temporary form of a human, my mind was actually blown by that quote. It is something that has stuck with me. And Jasmine is a very dear friend of mine. And so I feel like that is important. And I feel that's kind of what Kimmerer talks about in Braiding Sweetgrass, the importance of land. And so when we think about restoration to land, I also want us to think about in terms of restoration of land. So the land back movement, land coming back into the hands of Indigenous people, of tribal nations, remembering that everything that we are walking on, living on, shopping on is all Indigenous land. It was the home to tribal nations. And so there is a way that we should be thinking about it. We should be working in stewardship of the land. We should be thinking about how we can work with instead of against the land. So Braiding Sweetgrass, again, like I said, is one of my favorite books that I've read. And the first time I read it was shortly after it came out. The second time I read it was actually for a doctoral program that I am in the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, studying First Nations education. And this book was assigned for us to read in my ancestral leadership class. And I remember thinking, how does braiding sweetgrass fit in with ancestral leadership? The knowledge that we're given, and if you look at the subheading of the book, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, those are parts of ancestral leadership. The teachings of plants, those come from our ancestors. We are understanding that the land itself, the earth, the plants, all of it are our ancestors. And there are lessons that we have in every single one of those. And I think that's something that Kimmerer tries to get across in this book a lot. And so when I read it for the second time in class, understanding what I was searching for, understanding what I was looking for, it was very clear that the reason that this book was assigned to us in ancestral leadership is because of the leaders who came before us, the ancestors who came before us, who understood these lessons that Kimmerer talks about in the book and how they're passing along to us. And so her work in doing this is quite groundbreaking because it is using Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous teachings in order to give us a lesson that we should be getting from the start. But she also writes it in a way that a non-Indigenous person can read it and understand what's being said, understanding the science behind Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous pedagogies and what we're gaining from this. And so one of my favorite parts in this whole book is where she talks about the honorable harvest. And the honorable harvest is a collective term for the traditional Indigenous rules and ideas about the exchange of a life for a life. It's a very important phrase, the exchange of a life for a life. I think in terms, if we think about this in a Western mindset, we think about maybe going hunting, right? And, deer hunting is something that's very big here in Wisconsin. And, honoring that life, that's the taking of a life, right? And so you're killing an animal for sustenance to feed yourself, but also understanding that that same concept applies to our plant life, right? Our plant ancestors that we have here. When European colonizers first arrived on Turtle Island, which is what we call this land, they were awed by the abundance of natural resources. And so instead of thinking about the terms of natural resources and how can we protect them and how we can steward them. It was, wow, there's so much of this. What can we take? It became about taking as opposed to protecting. What would society be like if the rules and tenets of the honorable harvest were used in everything? For example, what if developers had to ask permission of the plants before covering them in concrete? I found this question to be very intriguing, right? If you had to stop, ask the ground or the plants, is it okay if I pour concrete over you? And then actually wait for the answer, what would you hear? This would mean that everyone would be subject to the same laws, the democracy of species, rather than privileged human beings above all other living things. So instead of putting humans at the hierarchy of everything, the Honorable Harvest talks about putting plants at the hierarchy of everything. And so what exactly is the honorable harvest? And so Kimmerer puts together this list that she came up with. And some of these things for me, when I read them, held so much weight and made me think about things in such a different way because we're all educated in a Western mindset. When we think about science, we think about it in a Western mindset. So kind of stripping back some of that Western way of thinking and understanding what the honorable harvest is made me actually go, there's something going on here. So there's a number of bullet points that she has, and so I want to go through some of them. So know the ways of the ones who take care of you so that you may take care of them. Introduce yourself. It sounds so silly, right? Why am I going to look at this cedar, right? This medicine before I harvest it? Why am I going to introduce myself to it? Because it's a living and breathing entity. Be accountable as the one who comes asking for life. Ask permission before taking. This is something that, again, if we go back to that question, what if developers had to ask permission of plants before covering them in concrete? Asking permission to take tobacco or sage or sweetgrass or a cedar, asking to take permission to take beforehand, and then actually stopping and hearing, listening for that answer. So abide by the answer that's given, right? Kimmerer gives an example of the leeks in the forest, right? Before she goes out to harvest them, she's asking permission and she's not given permission right away. And so she waits and she continues to come back. Never take the first, never take the last, right? You want to leave something behind. You don't want to take something before it's too ready, and you don't want to take the last of anything because it still needs to be there. Take only what you need. I think when we think about Western ways of doing things, overconsumption tends to be something that comes to mind right away. At least for me, when I read about the honorable harvest, it was something that came to mind right away for me, is we don't take what we need. We take more than what we need. And why were the Europeans so enthralled by the abundance of everything? It was because we were only taking what we needed. Take only that which is given. Never take more than half. Leave some for others, right? Other people are going to come to whatever garden you're in. Other people are going to come to whatever forest you're in. They're going to need the same medicines or same food sources that you're going to need. So leave them for them. Harvest in a way that minimizes harm, right? Don't rip our plant ancestors, a part that causes harm. Be mindful in how you are harvesting something. And after you harvest, use it respectfully, right? Because this is a plant life giving its life for you. There is something that is happening, right? There's this ecosystem that's going on. Share. Not everybody's going to have the same abilities or opportunities to harvest what you've been able to harvest. So share, right? You have elders in your community, thinking about your grandparents or older parents or somebody, share what you have because they may not have the ability to go out and access it for themselves. Give thanks for what's been given. give a gift in reciprocity for what has been taken. One of the things that I've been taught in my teachings is before I go out to take anything from the land, I make an offering first. And that offering is usually with tobacco. And we set it down wherever we're going to take something. We say a prayer of thanksgiving. And we offer the tobacco to the land, and the land then gives us something in return. So there's this reciprocal relationship. And I think it is um, not common in Western culture to think about a reciprocal relationship with the land. I think a lot of times when it comes to the thought process, there's this idea of having a dominion over as opposed to stewarding and living with instead of against, right? And when we think about uh, progress in terms of Western ways of thinking, building of buildings, and capitalism and all of that, that's not really a reciprocal relationship with the land. That is working against the land, right? It's not working with it. And sustain the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever. And this really gets into environmental ways of thinking, at least in my own opinion, and how we take care of the earth, if we take care of it, how it's going to take care of us. And so when I was thinking about, in terms of talking about this book, um, and my favorite part in it, which is the honorable harvest, and thinking about the Indigenous way of doing things and the Western way of doing things, another book that I thought about was one that I also read in my doctoral program. And it's very similar in the concepts that Kimmerer gives. And so, what I want to do is talk to you about the author first, which is Greg Kayate. He is Tewa Indigenous from the Santa Clara Pueblo. He was born in New Mexico. He worked at the Institute of American Indian Art for 21 years. If you are ever in Santa Fe, I encourage you to go to IAIA. They are an amazing institution. It's a school, but it also is an art museum, and it features some of the most beautiful and contemporary Indigenous art that is out there. And the way that they do things is absolutely amazing. So he did work at IAIA for 21 years. He has a degree in biology and secondary education from New Mexico Highlands University and a PhD from the International College in Los Angeles in social science education. He focuses on creating a curriculum on teaching Native students with an emphasis on the nature of nature. So, right there, that phrase, excuse me, is what immediately made me think about this book, Native Science, The Natural Laws of Interdependence. And this book discusses Indigenous methodologies as science. So it takes what we know as Indigenous people, our histories, and talks about it in terms of science. It puts the thinking in a more mainstream light while keeping true to Indigenous stories. And this is a very easy read. I highly recommend it. I thought it was going to be, I'm not a big science person. I'm going to be totally transparent with that. But this book talked about science, Western science, and Indigenous methodologies in a way that was very understanding. And I was able to get it right away. So not only does it do that, but it uses Indigenous stories as examples. We see in recent years how Indigenous knowledge has made its way into areas where it's usually not welcome. Climate activists are now quoting Indigenous climate knowledge into ways to potentially slow climate change's effect. So, Kayate talks about how our stories, our Indigenous ways of doing, are being brought into the mainstream, and how we are talking about Indigenous, calling it Native science or Indigenous science, is being used in Western science to talk about how we can better steward the earth. So Kayate's book and Kimmerer's book are kind of, if you put them together, we would be using Native science to bring along Kimmerer's points of how we can work with the earth, steward the land, and break Native science into mainstream science. Keate writes, quote, all the basic components of scientific thought and application are metaphorically represented in most native stories of creation and origin, end quote. If you've ever heard native origin stories or creation story, there's always some element of land and earth involved in it. In the Oneida creation story, I'm not going to get into the whole story because to, to tell it traditionally would take days, but I can briefly tell you that the as Sky Woman, who we refer to in our story, falls from the sky, she manages to grab a piece of land of earth with her, and she plants that on the back of a turtle once she lands, thus Turtle Island. But then that's how we get the mass of earth that we are on now. So there is a connection to land and science, but also within that story, it's talked about how the three sisters are formed. Corn, beans, and squash, and how you plant them and how you grow together. And we know from Western science, right? Western science tells us that when you grow these three uh, crops together, each of them is giving or taking something from the soil that is helping to fuel the other. And in native science, we know that as well. There's just not the scientific terms for it, like the nitrogen or whatever else is in soil that helps allow these plants to grow in the way that they do. So this is what Keate is telling about. From our origin stories, we are also seeing how our science is already starting to quote through. Quote, native science is a product of different creative journey and history than Western science. Acquiring knowledge takes on many forms, which Keate points out in the book. He speaks on the creation story that many Indigenous nations have. We learn how our people came to be through these stories. Storytelling, we also learn lessons, we learn ceremonies, and everyday life lessons. We take those stories and create visuals to go with them through art. So there's this idea that through our native science, we have our storytelling, or that our storytelling projects native science, and then through that, we also have the creation of art. There's an effort to preserve these teachings and create safeguards around this knowledge, primarily around Indigenous plants and medicines. So this gets into what Kimmerer already talks about in Braiding Sweetgrass. There are plans and projects to protect knowledge from Western science and to take credit for it. This can be considered an example of assessing whether or not knowledge passed down is learned or remembered. And Kimmerer talks about in Braiding Sweetgrass, and as I alluded to earlier, how the land remembers who we are and we remember who the land is. And Keate kind of confirms that within native science. Indigenous science is part of every aspect of life. The Santee Sioux activist and poet John Trudell, who was an amazing, wonderful activist who was at the occupation of Alcatraz in the 60s and has done part of the American Indian movement, says one of my favorite quotes. And when I hear this quote, not only do I think of Keate and native science, but I also think of Kimmerer in Bringing Sweetgrass and how she goes back to the foundations of Indigenous learning. And this quote from John Trudell says, we're not Indian and we're not Native Americans. We're older than both concepts. We're the people. We're the human beings. So we're the ones who were here from the very beginning. We are the ones that show that native science shows how much Indigenous thinking dates back to even before we walked the earth. There is this concept that we were here from the beginning, and we know through our creation stories how we were here from the beginning. And Kimmerer talks about how our relationship with the land was always there, and how in order to feel and be at one with the land, we have to have that relationship right off the bat. Keate goes a bit further in native science and talks about the science behind that and does it in a way that is able to kind of feel both worlds together. So when I was thinking about how I wanted to talk about Braiding Sweetgrass tonight, I didn't feel like I could do it justice without talking about this other book as well, which I do encourage you to go get. It's an easy read. It's not a fast read, but it's an easy read because the two go hand in hand. You've got one that very much is talking from the Indigenous perspective of our relationship with the land. And then you have one that takes that concept of Western science, throws in the native science, and you've got a really good combination of both. And so with that, I just wanted to open this up to any discussion, any questions that anyone might have, or anything that you wanted to share from your own experience reading the book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Because again, it is one of my favorite books, and there are so many lessons that we can learn from that book. And so if I forget to say it later on, I do want to thank everyone for joining this evening and spending a little bit of your time with me and giving me your perspectives of this book and allowing me to give you my perspectives. So with that, I'll open it to any questions. I am going to stop sharing my screen just so I have a better view of the chat. And let's see. Okay, it is being recorded, so you will get a copy of this, but please feel free to put anything, any questions or comments in the chat, and I will do my best to answer any of them.
You raise your hand, we can make it that you can share, you can ask your question out loud too.
Oh, perfect. Or even sharing your own thoughts of the book. I love to hear other people's perspectives on it as well. Okay, so yeah, in the chat, I recently reread Braiding Sweetgrass, and what struck me was not only her emphasis on reciprocity, but also responsibility. I think I read that word more than any other. I think that's huge. Reciprocity, responsibility, relationship, I think is another word that I feel like I read differently or I think about differently when I am thinking or reading about Braiding Sweetgrass. Um, there's a uh, relationship that we have that it is our responsibility. So bringing in your word as well, to have this relationship, but also to be reciprocal. I think that's really important. And I think the three words go hand in hand. And so thank you for sharing that. Yes, okay. So there was just a question here in the Q&A section. Can you give the last name of Jasmine? Yes, her last name is Niosh, and she is Menominee. And so she gave me that beautiful quote, "We are land in the temporary form of a human." So I think that quote is so powerful.
Carolyn has her hand up. I'm going to let her talk.
Yeah.
Carolyn, you just have to unmute.
Okay. So what I was asking is right at the beginning, you were giving all sorts of links besides your own Gmail and things. You said there was nativeland dot something. And so you could find out where you are. What was that?
Yes, I will put it in the chat. It is nativeland.ca.
Dot what?
CA.
CA.
CA. Yep, I put it in the chat. It's a great website to get a good start on to figuring out whose land you're on, and how it gives you, there's like, you can, like, once that pops up, you can click on like the tribal nation listed, and you can learn a little bit of history, which is really insightful, and just gives you a really good starting point to find out whose land that you're on.
Well, and I've been told that we're on the Oneida land that is linked to the people who are in Michigan. That's
You mean Wisconsin?
Wisconsin, sorry.
Yes.
Yes, Wisconsin. And I've been trying to get more interest, but maybe if they looked this up instead of me talking about it to the other people in my community, I could get some things being more enthusiastic. But
Oh, that sounds so
I
awesome.
do
Yeah.
understand that the Conservancy wants to bring some of you out to our retreat center and let them be in the cabins for a while to do some of their own being on the land. So I'm working
Oh, how
hard,
beautiful.
but it's very slow, I'll tell you that.
That's okay. Sometimes the
Thank you.
best things take the most time and it's worth it in the end. So thank you.
And thank you for your talk, but I just wanted to get that one piece of information because I am going to follow through on all this. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, of course. Absolutely. What other questions or comments does anyone have? There's definitely nothing wrong you can say here. So please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand or anything.
While people are thinking, I'm just going to let everyone know that on Tuesday, April 22nd at 7 p.m., Monique Grace Smith will be Zooming in. She wrote the young adult version of Braiding Sweetgrass. So that will be something for people to look forward to. Oh,
The
and I see a
young
hand.
adult, yeah, the young adult version is actually very good.
So Vanessa, it's her hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Heather, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Mhm.
And I really think that in these times, it's so important for us to get these deep messages, around interconnectedness. So it's really moving to me. Um, I have a couple questions. One is about, you said you offer tobacco. And I don't know if you said sage as well. And I know there have been some questions around cultural appropriation, and like not wanting to use medicines that, if we don't have direct ancestry, that use those medicines, and if our direct ancestry came from other places, And
Mhm.
that's one question. And the other question, you said, which was so moving, like ask the plant and wait for an answer. I haven't read that part of Braiding Sweetgrass. I only read a few of the chapters.
Mhm.
But I feel sometimes like as Westerners, like people at least, with non-Indigenous heritage, that we don't really know how to slow down enough to really listen. And so like that, I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, about speed and slowness and, even how to listen to the plants.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your questions, Vanessa. So, first one, I am a big fan of people using medicines if they understand and have been given a lesson behind the medicine from an elder. There are certain lessons that I've been given by my elders when it comes to using medicines. There are certain times of the month, especially for women, that you should not be using medicines. And so, and there are certain times of year and certain ceremonies. So I encourage people to educate themselves, be educated first, in how to use the medicine before you do that. So, like for my example, one of my lessons I was given is when a woman is on her moon or her menstrual cycle, she's not to touch medicines. Because at that moment, during that time, during that cycle, we are too powerful in to be able to touch medicines. So we just don't do that. And so there are other tribal cultures who, have different lessons. That was the lesson that was given to me. So I encourage people, if you are able to reach out to tribal communities in your area, and you're genuine and you want to learn, please do that. So that's the question. That's the answer around medicines. In terms of slowing down and listening, you are absolutely right, Vanessa, when you talk about how in Western society or in Western way of thinking, something we just don't do. And I personally am super guilty of that. I feel like I am a go, go, go person, and I don't ever take the time to sit and listen. I've gotten better at it in the past few years, but I will tell you one of the things that changed for me is actually when I many years ago was working for a tribal nation. uh, I had to learn the art of slowing down, and understanding um, lessons and understanding the importance of taking time and doing that. And I learned that because not only was I working for a tribal nation, but I was working on a reservation. So I was able to be near my elders and learn from them and really taking in those lessons. And I get it. We're all busy all of the time. And, sometimes even going for a hike or a walk in the forest can feel like a sense of being busy or something that you're doing just to pass time. However, it is in those moments that I think that we can take the most time to stop and to think. And sometimes in the moments that I have found for myself when I pause everything that's going on around me and I sit and I just listen, we're told the most amazing things. One of the stories that I am very happy to share with you is back in 2016, my husband and I were going on a road trip to South Dakota. I don't remember why we were going to South Dakota, but we went to South Dakota. And it was just a road trip, and it was very flat, but it was fine. But I do recall it was the first time I saw the Badlands. I think we were just going like on a road trip. So I saw the Badlands, which was very interesting and very cool. If you've never been, I encourage you to go. But one of the places we stopped was on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is on the southern western corner of South Dakota. And Wounded Knee is is on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And it was 2016, and I was just finishing up with my master's degree, and I had no idea what I was going to do. I didn't know what I was going to do with my master's degree in history. I literally didn't know what I was going to do. And so we go to Wounded Knee, and I'm reading the signs because as a history nerd, that's what I do. And it was hot, it was warm, but it wasn't hot, and there was a breeze blowing, and it was a very quiet space because it's a very sacred space if you understand what happened at Wounded Knee. And I was pondering this question. I was meditating on this question. Okay, I'm getting ready to graduate. What am I going to do with this degree? And the wind was blowing, and I was being very quiet. And it was in that moment, in this quietness of me pausing and standing still and listening to the breeze, that I was told in that moment what I needed to do. And I will go to my grave believing this, that it was the ancestors coming through and saying, you're going to tell the story of us. You're going to talk about us and our history and our sacrifices and our survival. And it was like, there was the breeze, right? It was just the breeze talking. And I feel like in those quiet moments of meditation is when we are given the most of our answers. Some people call it prayer. Some people call it meditation. Some people call it being still. But it is in those moments that we are able to hear what the land or the plants or your spirit is trying to tell you. And do I take enough of those moments? No, I don't. Should I take more? Absolutely, because I get the most um, joy out of those moments. And I think in Braiding Sweetgrass, when Robin Wall Kimmerer is talking about stopping and listening, it's those moments that she's speaking of, because the land or the plants or whoever, the wind, they're going to give you the answer. You just have to be patient and stop and listen. And I think that's something that I need to get better at doing. And I think that if we all got better at doing, maybe we'd be in a different place, right? Than we are now. But I think now more than ever, we have to stop and take those pauses and listen to what we're being told. Any other questions? And I hope that answered your questions, Vanessa.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much, Heather.
Of course, thank you. I appreciate being asked.
Beautiful story about what you heard.
Oh, yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Let's see. Okay, in the chat, how do the Indigenous people feel about we as non-Indigenous humans using herbs rather than tobacco plants we have harvested from our land? I mean, so here's the thing, it goes back to honorable harvest. I think if we are following the honorable harvest that Kimmerer talks about in Braiding Sweetgrass, it's, you know, only taking what you need, only taking when ready, not taking the first, not taking the last, sharing. And then I would go a bit further in saying, you know, understand what you're using, what you're taking. And then back to Kimmerer, you know, be responsible, share. And so I think that is something that could be good. Also in the chat, advice for white farmers working to work in harmony with the land without appropriating Indigenous traditions. Absolutely. So Indigenous people are not the only ones that have certain ways that we interact with the land, right? Lots of different cultures think about land and work with land in various ways. I think, you know, mindfulness is one of the things that I would have people look for, but also in terms of like listening to the land. So I think if you are someone working in agriculture, if you're a farmer, as you are in the chat here, you're kind of already doing it, right? You only plant crops, certain crops during certain time periods. You only harvest during certain time periods. You are replenishing the land with rotating crops. You plant blanket crops to help replenish nutrients or anything that the land is missing out on. So you're already doing it, whether or not you realize you're using Indigenous methodology to do it. And so as long as you're continuing that and working in harmony with the land, making sure we're not destroying, right? I think farming is much different because you are doing all of those things. You're rotating, you're replenishing, you're harvesting when needed, you're planting when needed. You're already following the cycles of the season. So you're already doing with that. So I think maybe adding, if I were to give advice to anything, it would maybe be adding in mindfulness, right? Talking to the land, talking to the crops or the plants, and just continue. To me, that is working in harmony. Like you're already doing it. There is so much responsible farming happening that I feel like the way farming and agriculture are changing in this country, for some, is definitely changing for the better. So thank you for putting that question in the chat. I appreciate it. Any other questions or comments? I really appreciate this conversation and just everyone's excitement around this. So thank you. While we give just another minute or two, I will put my contact in the chat again in case you think of something later. You can contact me. Oh, hold on. I didn't put it for everyone. Just kidding. Let me type it in again. But yeah, please feel free to contact me and, you know, if you think of something later on, and I appreciate it. And I hope Braiding Sweetgrass is one of the books that stays in your home library or on your Kindle or wherever you read your books. I hope you have it in there and you continue to reference it and look to it and learn something new every time you read it. What is the right relationship to Indigenous people in these earth honoring farming practices that we are doing already. Let's see, what is the right relationship to Indigenous people? In these earth honoring. Right, yeah. So I think the practices that many responsible and sustainable farming is already happening, it's kind of like a nod to Indigenous people. That's the practices are already being done. So like I said earlier, the uh, uh, stewardship of the land, replenishing the soil with different crops. I know some agriculture and farming areas do controlled burns, and we know that that helps replenish the soil. Rotation of crops helps replenish and protect and steward the earth. And I think sustainable farming is actually something that is really important and that's helping the earth as well. It is also a nod to Indigenous folks, right? Sustainable agriculture is something that continues to be something that is worked on in food sovereignty programs across different tribal nations. And so, again, or like giving credit to Indigenous people. I mean, there's not a need, right? I think if you want to credit Indigenous people in some way, shape, or form, I think when you practice your farming practices, you show reciprocity with the land, show kindness to the land, show thankfulness to the land, right? Being reciprocal in that relationship. The land is giving you something, you give the land something. So I think in however way you show gratitude, that is what you should be doing for the land because the land is a living and breathing entity. So that's what I would say to that. And if there aren't any other questions or comments, I just want to say thank you guys so much. I appreciate this conversation. I appreciate this discussion. And again, I hope Braiding Sweetgrass is something that stays in your home library and that you continue to refer to it and learn something new every single time you read it.
Thank you so much for coming
Thank you.
tonight.
My pleasure.
Have a nice evening, everybody.